It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Reading helps with resilience, particularly for those kids who are most at risk. And I think that's fascinating.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au, and I'm here with Kylie, wife and mum to our 6 kids, and Happy Families podcast partner. Kylie, I've got a question for you. When you think about our 6 children and their naming process, did you name pretty much all of them?
I sure did.
So, I mean, I vaguely remember with 1 or 2 of the kids, I had some name preferences, and usually what happened in those cases was that you humoured me, you let me believe whatever I wanted to believe, and then at the end of the labour, as I was a blubbering mess, crying and telling you how amazing you were and how much I love this new baby, you would look at me and tell me her name is going to be, and then you would share the name. That's about how it worked, right?
Well, I worked out very quickly that when I was in that space, you pretty much would give me anything I wanted.
Yeah, that's kind of how it worked, right? But there were a couple of kids that it didn't work that way. Like it took a while to come up with some names.
All of them were named by the time they were born, except for number 6.
Except for Emily. Yeah.
Yes, she was nearly 9 days old before we came to a consensus. But the only reason that happened was because it was the very first time that you put your foot down and said, I actually want to have a part of this.
Well, that was I'm stumbling and stammering because I want to say this with sensitivity and gentleness, but the name that you chose for the baby was one that I just couldn't go with. I don't know if I should share the name.
I think that I could make a lot of money selling this name. It's beautiful.
Well, okay, you might as well say it.
I wanted to call her Ruby Red.
Ruby Red. Ruby Red. And I mean, for any Ruby Reds who are listening or any parents who have named their children Ruby Red, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't live with a child who was called Ruby Red. I just, names are such
Ruby was my great-grandmother's name.
Right. So, I mean, it's meaningful.
And red is actually my favourite colour.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was a little bit edgy, and I loved the fact that she was going to be called my favourite.
Right. And you couldn't stand the name that I had.
No, I couldn't.
Which was Olive Joy.
I can't stand eating them, let alone the colour.
So obviously we were at an impasse, and eventually 9 days down the track we came up with the name Emily Eden, which we have been really excited about and happy about for...
Well, let's just say even after a month of having her called Emily Eden, you asked me if you could change her name by default.
Right. Well, the reason that I raised this, and again, I mean, a couple of months ago, we did a podcast episode talking about some of the biggest bogan names based on a news report at one of the better-known news establishments in Australia. I don't know that we were sensitive enough and gentle enough. I mean, names really are personal. And as you explain why you like the name Ruby Red, I actually have a lot of sympathy, recognition, understanding, empathy for why you might want to call a child a particular name. There's a professional baby namer in the United States, though, who is charging real dollars to name babies for people. Her name is Taylor Humphries. She's got a TikTok account, and she is a professional baby namer. Minimum fee to get your baby named, $2,000. Would you pay $2,000 to not go through the grief that we went through for 9 days as we argued over names?
This is really intriguing. I would actually like to be a fly on the wall and see how this process works because, like you said, naming a child is such a personal thing.
Yeah.
Even though it was pretty tricky, number 6, I remember when the health nurse rang on day 5 to ask how everything was going. We were settling in, and did we have a name for baby yet? And I looked across at her door. I was in her bedroom changing her nappy at the time, and I looked across, and a friend of mine had brought me this gorgeous little house tag that said number 6 on it, and it was hanging on her door. And I kind of went, number 6? She had no idea what to say.
Yep.
But it was such a tricky one. For us, I think part of the reason was we'd already named 5 children. They each have a middle name.
They're all girls.
10 of my girls' names.
Right.
But I think the other thing that was really tricky this time around was we kind of knew she was our last.
Yeah.
And there was just something so important about that process for us.
I think that there's a market here, though. Like this baby namer she's made $200,000 in the last year naming. She's done 100 baby names, $200,000 in a year to be a professional baby namer. So understand the process. She'll charge a minimum fee if it's just going to be a phone call, but then she might go and do genealogical investigation and find some family names and puts this list together, bringing up all of the old family names that have been carried through the generations. Recently, she chose the baby name Parks, P-A-R-K-S, Parks, for a couple who had their first kiss in a town called Parker. And I think it's kind of creative. She also advised an anxious mother who was considering changing her young daughter's name Isla, I-S-L-A, Isla, because it kept being mispronounced. And she was paid for telling the mum to stick with the Scottish name. $2,000 to keep the name. She didn't even do any work. She said, I think you should keep it. That'll be $2,000. Pay the invoice. Thanks very much. I think it's fascinating the way that people do this. Her top picks for one mum recently who was having a third child, and she needed a name that would go with Emmett and Miller, her other two kids, Emmett and Miller. What am I going to do? And so she said Grady, Wilson, Whalen or Fletcher. I mean, I'm not quite sure that I get it. I don't know how she can charge $2,000 plus up to $13,000 if she's going to do the genealogical investigations. Like, this is big money, but obviously people are willing to pay so they don't have to go through the pain of. And I guess if they get a bad name, you can say, "Oh, it wasn't our fault. It was the baby namer."
Look, there's always depot, right?
I guess there must be. Anyway, we should get on with the podcast and talk about what we're talking about today. After the break, we're going to come back and chat about 2 doctor's desk studies. As you know, every month we love to dive into what science is telling us about how to be better parents, what the latest parenting science is. And there's a couple of studies that have come out recently that highlight how we can help our children to be more resilient. And I'll give you some hints around this. One of the studies has to do with the power of reminiscence, and the other has to do with the power of reading for resilience. Your daughter just walked by, eyes glued to her phone, expression unreadable. You ask her to put it down, but she balks. You know it's not good for her, but you're not sure why or how to support better choices. In the webinar Pixel Perfect, I join with psychologist and teen tech expert Jocelyn Brewer to discuss how to set screen boundaries that work for you and your daughter. Check out Pixel Perfect now on the Happy Families webshop.
It's the Happy Families podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. I'm really curious how reading and remembrance can help build resilience.
Okay, so the first study we're going to talk about for our Doctor's Desk episode today comes from the University of South Australia. Some researchers there. Well, actually, let's get the context right first of all. In Australia, there are a lot of children who are at risk. In fact, it's the same right around the world. In 2021, so this is a COVID year, nearly 300,000 kids aged 0 to 17 had one or more child protection notifications. 105,000 of them were the subject of an investigation, and about 50,000, that's 1,000 Australian children every week, were the subject of substantiated abuse or neglect. In other words, we know that there is maltreatment going on here. We know that there is something damaging and wrong happening. These children are experiencing genuine adverse childhood experiences literally through the fault of their parents who are being neglectful or abusive. And so the researchers were trying to work out, what can we do in terms of resilience with these kids? So 65,000 children completed the early Australian development census some years ago at 5 to 6 years of age when they were starting primary school. And the researchers found 3,400 of these kids that were high risk. They'd experienced maltreatment. And what they found was that boys are developmentally behind the girls, particularly if they've been exposed to abuse or neglect. Now, we've always known that boys are behind when it comes to academics and neurological development. This is not a new thing, but it's particularly the case if they've been exposed to abuse or neglect. And these University of South Australia researchers basically said, well, what can we discover when it comes to resilience, protective factors, the kinds of factors that will help these kids to do well in life? And in a nutshell, what they found was that there's a handful of things that can predict resilience. Number one, the older you are when these adverse experiences occur, the less likely it is that they'll have significant impact. So obviously younger kids have more negative impacts from those maltreatment, abuse and neglect scenarios.
When you think about little children, so much of what goes on in the world, they don't understand.
Right.
And yet you're suggesting, the data's suggesting that the younger they are, when they experience these things that they can't actually understand,
Yeah.
the bigger the impact.
Yeah. And I don't know that I've got a really great explanation for this. This is not an area that I've studied in depth, but I have a hypothesis, and that is that because our mind is such a great storyteller, it's so great at coming up with a narrative explanation for things. When we're younger, we don't have that same storytelling capability. And so things that happen to us feel random, which make us feel increasingly vulnerable and at risk. And so therefore, the world feels increasingly unpredictable and unsafe. Whereas as you get older, when these horrible things happen, they're still horrible, they're still adverse, and they still can be traumatizing. But when you've got the capacity to make up a story about it and to highlight or understand the predictable or unpredictable nature of it and why, you may adapt better to it. I think that's part of the reason.
Yeah, interesting.
So further on, though, the researchers found that not only being older, not only was that a predictor of resilience, not having an emotional condition is obviously going to be much better for you. And the other thing that's better for you is being read to at home. In other words, reading helps with resilience, particularly for those kids who are most at risk. And I think that's fascinating when you consider just the simple fact that somebody is sitting with you, or maybe you're sitting in their lap and they're turning pages of a book and reading to you, and it makes you more resilient. I think that's an astonishing and simple intervention that can make so much difference. And
when you think of these kids that are in high-risk situations, the likelihood that somebody is doing that
very, very low.
Very low.
Yeah. So the take-home message from this particular study, I mean, most of the people who are listening to this podcast are probably raising children who are not at risk of maltreatment, abuse, neglect. But you may know somebody who is. Or maybe you just want to give your children as much of a protective factor as you can. And while this study has been done with kids who are at risk, we know that time together, connection, physical touch, reading, we know that these things actually boost resilience, they boost well-being, and they can make a difference. So that's study number one from the doctor's desk. The second one we're going to have to go through fairly quickly because our time is getting away from us, but some researchers in New Zealand, Kylie, at the University of Otago, did another fascinating study, this one about reminiscence. They did this study, and basically they found that toddlers whose mothers received special coaching in talking about their memories, those toddlers grew into teenagers who experienced better well-being.
That's intriguing. We've talked about this before on the podcast, this idea of helping our children understand where they came from.
Yes.
You know, sharing your family memories with them and stories about, you know, people in their past, their grandparents, us growing up. But this obviously is kind of taking it to a whole nother level because you're acknowledging that they're actually being trained in a certain way and a certain style of sharing memories.
Yeah. The do you know scale is what you're talking about. Professor Marshall Duke from Emory University is the one who came up with this idea that if you teach children where they're from by just teaching them about you, your life, look at the photos of where you grew up, how parents met, what went on at the child's birth, what school you went to, all those kinds of things, they help kids to be more resilient. This University of Otago research basically found that these 15-year-olds told more coherent stories about turning points in their lives if their mums had been taught these conversational techniques 14 years earlier when they were 1. And the conversational technique is really simple. You sit down with your little one and you reminisce about the stuff that's just happened. We were down at the park and we were throwing the styrofoam plane and it did big loops. And do you remember the ducks on the water? And do you remember the way it was windy and the plane went along? Like, it's literally just about what we would call active and constructive conversations. Active in that we're talking about it, and constructing, we're building it into something more and more and more. Reminiscence is a protective factor for resilience.
I wonder if our 8-year-old actually has done a bit of research herself, because just yesterday we were sitting in the car and she says, do you remember when we were at the park that day, Mum? And she told me all of these things that happened at the park and I can't for the life of me remember it, but it was so clear to her.
I just think this is such an important thing to highlight, because as a parent listening to the podcast, a time poor parent who wants answers now, this is something that is an answer for building resilience, and it's so simple. In fact, 2 answers today. Number 1, read to your kids. Number 2, reminisce with them. This is kind of the power of the grateful things conversations that you have around the dinner table at night. What were you grateful for today? What stood out to you? What was wonderful about today? Let's share those stories. Let's reenact those stories. Let's relive those stories, because it helps kids to feel connected, understood, and it gives them that narrative arc for their lives. One of the researchers, the lead researcher, who's a clinical psychologist, her name is Dr. Claire Mitchell, says that there's a whole lot of data that shows this well-being drop during adolescence. And I talk about this all the time in my live presentations. I show the data that highlights that from the age of 8 through to 18, resilience it's on this downward slope. And it keeps on dropping all the way through into adulthood. I mean, it's awful to watch. And only about 1 in 4 of our kids maintains a good or high level of resilience right through to the end of year 12. 1 in 4. 3 in 4 are not maintaining that high level of resilience. And so if this is the case, having conversations like this can make such a difference. Resilience, reminiscence, reading. The 3 R's for today's podcast. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. We really hope that today's podcast has been helpful for you. The Doctor's Desk will return again next month. In the meantime, if you'd like more info about making your family happier, please visit us at our Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families, or happyfamilies.com.au.